But getting things done and keeping Virginia and our country moving forward is more important than ever. And the three issues that I want to briefly touch on, and then we'll love to hear from you all. But the kind of three themes that I want to focus on if I get the opportunity to continue to represent Virginia are as follows. First, one of the things that makes Virginia, the Valley, and America different than I think almost any place else in the world is that in America, everybody ought to get a fair shot. Doesn't mean we can guarantee you success, but it does mean that everybody ought to get a fair shot. And I have to tell you, I am a living example of the American dream. I was born in a middle-class family, went to public schools all my life. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. Some of you know that I managed to make a little bit of a living out of cell phones. But, some of you who follow politics may recall, my first business failed, my second business failed. If you get Richmond TV, I've gone up on TV a little bit now. I was living basically out in a car, sleeping on my friends' couches for a while. But what I got was that fair shot. And what I worry about increasingly is whether our kids or our grandkids are going to have the same kind of fair shot. And if we lose that sense that in America, if you work hard, you can make it, then it's going to be a very different country. And there are a host of issues around this, and I'm not just one that I've spent the last 9 or 10 months working on a lot, and think we've got a lot more work to do. Is I wonder whether I would have had the courage to take that first, second, or third shot if I'd come out of college and law school with the kind of crushing student debt that's now hitting this whole country. Now, I got out of college and law school combined with a total of $15,000 in debt. You want to think about prediction here, next financial crisis, student debt. $1.1 trillion in student debt, more student debt than there is credit card debt in this country. And in America, you shouldn't have to go broke if you want to go to college. This is not just a James Madison kind of statement. This is the question about, I was asking Barry how much he does on residential home purchase. He does more leasing. But the reason why the housing market's come back a bit, but not enough, 20-something, 30-somethings can't afford to buy a house if they got student debt. Can't afford to start a business. And there are some solutions. Let me give you a couple ideas that I've been working on. One, I actually got a bill with Marco Rubio, Republican Senator from Florida, and let me tell you, every major piece of legislation I work on, I've got a Republican partner. Now, I know many of us here may be Democrats, but I think, particularly at this moment in our country, that quite honestly, the American public doesn't trust either political party to give them a blank check. So if you start, at least, with a Republican partner, then I think many Americans will say, well, maybe this is actually in the country's interest.
Thank you.
Which is, Lord knows, thank you, Faye. So what our bill does, not a big bill, but it makes some sense. It's called Know Before You Go. And it gets data that we've already got out there. We take every college, every community college, every career and technical education school, and say, before you go to school, you and your parents ought to look at what your chances of graduating are. Does it take normally more than 8 semesters? If you major in art history the way my daughter did, are you going to get a job? And how much is that job going to pay?
Did she?
We're on the second or third internship. Unpaid internship. But I'm fortunate enough to be able to. Not everybody's got the kind of flexibility I've got. I couldn't afford it to take an internship if I'd gotten out of school 35 years ago. And so, one of the things we also need to recognize is that if you actually found out, I was over at Piedmont Valley Community College the other day, they had a 95% placement rate on anybody who was taking a medical technologist associate's degree. Now, I'm not saying everybody ought to do that, but I think if most folks saw their choices, better informed consumers make sense. Second idea we got, and we're going to actually have some legislation on this coming up, is that if you can go out and get a mortgage, 4.25%, 4.5%, why are you paying student debt at 7 or 8%? You got to provide an ability to refinance student debt at a cheaper rate. Third thing we got to do, and I don't want to just focus on this issue, but it's in an area where I don't think there's Republican or Democrat answers, but there's common sense answers. Why does college have to be 4 years and high school have to be 4 years? One of the things I tried to start when I was governor, and I'm disappointed the other governors didn't follow it, but the same, you ought to be able to take at least in your senior year of high school, dual enrollment in community colleges and have that count toward your degree requirements, not just as electives. And if you qualify for a Pell Grant, especially for those people who are first generation going, why don't they go ahead and be able to use that Pell Grant in high school to pay for the community college dual enrollment, help save money? Another idea, and again, we're going to have legislation on all these. If you're Barry's trying to keep a young person working in that Matchbox, wonderful facility, why shouldn't an employer be able to pay up to $5,000 in compensation, not directly to the employee, but directly to pay down the student debt? Good retainment tool, and doesn't cost the employer anymore. They still get the deduction, but the student or the young person actually gets that money pre-tax. So there are ideas around this question, so we make sure we keep this notion of a fair shot. Fair shot, it means as well, when you get done with school, whatever you go to, you got to have a job. And, many of you know my background was an entrepreneur. Those of you who don't know, I started Nextel and a few other companies along the way. I've been very blessed. But I spent a lot of time in the Senate trying to work on how do you get more job growth. And the data shows, ultimately you got to use data. Data shows that Kauffman Foundation said 80% of all the new jobs created in America in the last 30 years have come from startups. It's not IBM. It's not the local barber shop. It's startups. Now, some of those companies like Nextel or Google or whatever, big companies now, but they start up. So how do we do more for innovation? One of the forums we held here in Harrisonburg about a year and a half ago, was about how we could use crowdfunding, the internet, to raise money for startup companies. We need to push the government. We've got a law that says they can do that, but we need to push the regulators to get out the regulations to help accelerate. We ought to make sure our tax code, actually I've got a bill on this one with Frank Wolf, who's been a good member of Congress for a long time. Virginia is losing someone who's, I think, brought a lot of common sense that says, why don't we have a tax code that actually supports companies moving back into the United States as opposed to shipping jobs offshore?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. In Virginia, we could go against California or New York or North Carolina, but when we went against China or Canada, they would do other incentives. We don't have any incentive package for the whole question of bringing jobs back in and how we keep helping startup jobs. We've got some ideas as well about fair shot means we ought to have a rational immigration policy in this country. It's time for immigration. Right now, our borders aren't secure, people are undocumented, aren't paying taxes, and if you end up with a PhD from JMU and you've got 14 job offers and instead we're saying you got to go home, you don't even have to go home, you just got to move to Canada. Because Canada, Australia, UK have all changed their laws to say recognize it's a global competition for talent. So how do we keep this fair shot approach so that everybody in this country has that right to have the same kind of chance that I have?